I'm not an extravagant liver. I'm not stockpiling cars and diamonds and stuff like that.
There are love stories that define an era, and then there are the ones that quietly destroy the people living them. Ali MacGraw was, by every measure, one of the most luminous women Hollywood had ever produced. Her face graced magazine covers. Her performances moved audiences to tears. Her name alone opened doors. And yet, at the very peak of everything she had worked for, she made a choice that stunned the industry, baffled her admirers, and cost her more than anyone watching from the outside could have possibly imagined. She walked away from a powerful marriage, a soaring career, and the life that most women in Hollywood would have fought to protect. And she did it for a man. Not just any man. She did it for Steve McQueen, the most dangerous, magnetic, and ultimately destructive force she would ever encounter. Decades later, Ali MacGraw has finally spoken with the kind of raw, unvarnished honesty that only time and hard-won healing can produce. What she revealed about the affair, the marriage, and the woman she lost along the way has left fans completely stunned. This is the story she kept buried for years, and it begins long before anyone suspected there was anything to hide. To understand what Ali MacGraw gave up, you first have to understand what she had built. Born in 1939 in Pound Ridge, New York, Ali grew up in a household that was, by her own account, emotionally complicated. Her father was a temperamental man whose volatility shaped the way young Ali related to love. She learned early that keeping the peace mattered more than speaking her truth. That childhood conditioning would follow her into every relationship she ever had, though she wouldn't fully recognize it until much later in life. Despite those early shadows, Ali carved out something extraordinary for herself. She worked as a fashion assistant, modeled, and eventually found her way into film. Her breakthrough came with the 1969 film Goodbye, Columbus, which announced her as a genuine talent. Not just a beautiful face, but an actress with real emotional depth and presence. Then came Love Story in 1970, and everything changed. The film became a cultural phenomenon. Ali MacGraw became a household name overnight, and her tearful, iconic performance made her one of the most talked-about actresses on the planet. She received an Academy Award nomination. The world was at her feet. During this period, she was also married to Robert Evans, one of the most powerful executives in Hollywood. Evans had championed her talent, helped shape her career, and given her a stability that matched the grandeur of her professional success. From the outside, Ali MacGraw appeared to have it all: beauty, talent, a famous husband, and a career on a relentless upward trajectory. But as she would later reflect, something beneath the surface was always quietly restless. She had constructed a life that looked perfect, but she had never fully examined whether it actually felt that way. That examination would come, but not in the way anyone expected. In 1971, Ali MacGraw received a film offer that would change the course of her life forever. The project was called The Getaway, and it came attached to one of the biggest names in Hollywood, Steve McQueen. At the time, McQueen was operating at the absolute height of his powers. He was rugged, rebellious, and possessed of a charisma that seemed almost supernatural. Directors wanted to work with him. Studios catered to him. Women fell for him with a consistency that was almost legendary. He was, in the language of that era, completely untamable. When Ali and Steve met during pre-production, the chemistry was immediate. She has spoken about it in interviews over the years, with a kind of disbelieving candor, as if even now she cannot fully explain the gravitational pull. There was something about him, she has said, that disrupted the very air in a room. He didn't perform his magnetism. It simply existed, raw and unfiltered, and it drew people toward him, whether they intended to move or not. Ali was not immune. In fact, she may have been more susceptible than most, because what McQueen projected, danger, authenticity, a complete disregard for the polished rules of Hollywood, was everything her carefully constructed life was not. By the time filming on The Getaway wrapped in 1972, the affair was already well underway. Ali and Steve had fallen into something that felt, to her, less like a choice and more like a current she simply could not swim against. The fact that she was married to Robert Evans made the situation complicated on every level. Evans was not an ordinary husband. He was a man of enormous power and influence, and their marriage existed inside a very public fishbowl. But Ali, by her own admission, found herself unable to step back from what was happening. She has described the decision to pursue things with McQueen not as something she carefully weighed, but as something she surrendered to, completely and without reservation. The fallout was swift and seismic. When the affair became known, it sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Robert Evans was blindsided. The industry whispered. The press speculated. And Ali MacGraw, who had spent years being celebrated as a symbol of grace and elegance, suddenly found herself at the center of a scandal that threatened to reshape how the world saw her entirely. Ali divorced Robert Evans and married Steve McQueen in 1973. The world watched with fascination. On paper, they were a stunning couple, the brooding, anti-establishment action star and the luminous, introspective actress. Photographs from that period show two people who appeared deeply absorbed in each other, tucked away from the glittering chaos of the industry they both belonged to. They settled in a Malibu beach house, intentionally removed from Hollywood's social machinery. And for a brief, shimmering period, Ali has said it genuinely felt like freedom. But the reality of life with Steve McQueen was something the photographs never captured. Behind the image of sun-soaked Malibu simplicity was a relationship defined by an increasingly severe imbalance of power. McQueen, for all his charisma, was a deeply wounded man. His father had abandoned the family when Steve was still an infant, and his mother, struggling with her own demons, had eventually sent him to live in a reform school for troubled boys. Those early experiences had carved into him a profound mistrust of intimacy and a compulsive need to control his environment and the people within it. What Ali had initially interpreted as strength and independence began revealing itself as something more suffocating. McQueen did not simply want a quiet life. He wanted total dominance over the shape of their domestic world. He made clear, early and often, that he did not want Ali to continue acting. He pushed her to abandon the career she had spent years building. He wanted her present, contained, and completely focused on him. And Ali, shaped by a childhood that had taught her to shrink herself in order to keep peace, complied. She cooked. She cleaned. She stepped away from auditions and film offers. She played, as she has described it, a version of a woman she constructed specifically because she believed that was what he needed her to be. The career she sacrificed during those years was not a minor thing to set aside. She was, at that point, one of the most sought-after actresses in Hollywood. The roles she turned down, the momentum she abandoned, these were not small losses. They were the kind of opportunities that, once passed, rarely return, and McQueen knew that. His insistence on a prenuptial agreement before their marriage was matched by his insistence on her professional withdrawal. For Ali, these demands did not feel like negotiations. They felt like conditions of being loved, conditions she accepted because she had never learned to believe she deserved love on any other terms. Years into their marriage, something in Ali MacGraw began to quietly disappear. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a gradual erosion, so incremental that she barely noticed it happening until there was almost nothing left to notice. The woman who had commanded screens and captivated audiences was now spending her days in a beach house in Malibu, negotiating around the volatile moods of a man whose emotional demands seemed to expand with every passing season. McQueen's jealousy became increasingly suffocating. He could be provoked by something as ordinary as Ali holding eye contact with another man at a dinner party. Yet his own behavior operated by an entirely different set of rules. He flirted openly, indulged his impulses freely, and seemed almost deliberately indifferent to the double standard he enforced. Ali learned to navigate this with the careful precision of someone walking through a room full of fragile things. She measured her words. She monitored her expressions. She became, over time, fluent in the exhausting language of managing someone else's insecurities at the expense of her own. Both of them were drinking heavily during this period, a fact Ali has spoken about with unflinching honesty. Alcohol blurred the edges of the tension between them and made it temporarily bearable, but it also stripped away the communication that might have given the relationship any real chance. What had started as intimate evenings became volatile standoffs. What had once felt like passion began feeling like siege. The Malibu house, which had seemed like a sanctuary, became the setting for a kind of slow psychological suffocation that Ali would spend years afterward trying to understand and name. Infidelity entered the picture on both sides, and Ali has not shied away from acknowledging her own role in the deterioration of their marriage. There was a mutual unraveling happening. Two people whose unresolved wounds had collided and were now tearing each other apart from the inside. By 1977, it was over. Ali walked away from the marriage carrying grief, confusion, and a profound disorientation about who she actually was outside of someone else's definition of her. The legal end of the marriage in 1977 brought some measure of relief, but it did not bring closure. That would prove impossible to find, because in November 1980, Steve McQueen died. He was 50 years old, taken by pleural mesothelioma, an aggressive cancer linked to asbestos exposure, after a rapid decline that shocked even those who knew he was ill. He had pursued experimental treatment in Mexico after exhausting options at home, and he died shortly after surgery, leaving behind a cinematic legacy and an enormous amount of unfinished emotional business. For Ali, the news landed differently than grief for a former partner might typically arrive, because with McQueen, there had never been real resolution. The relationship had simply stopped, first through separation and then through death, without either of them ever truly reaching the kind of reckoning that might have allowed both people to make genuine peace with what had happened between them. She has spoken about this absence of closure with a quietness that carries more weight than dramatic declarations ever could. The questions she never got to ask him, the things she never got to say, the understanding she was still working toward when the door closed permanently. What his death forced her to confront was not only the loss of the man, but the loss of the possibility. She had, somewhere beneath the pain and the exhaustion, held onto some unexamined belief that things could eventually be understood, perhaps even repaired. His death removed that possibility entirely and left her alone with a grief that was layered and complicated, love and resentment and guilt and sorrow all compressed together, with no outlet and no resolution available. In 1985, Ali MacGraw checked herself into the Betty Ford Center. What began as a recognition of her struggle with alcohol quickly became something far more expansive, a full excavation of the patterns that had governed her emotional life for decades. She began to understand, with the help of therapy and the structured honesty of recovery, that her tendency to disappear into relationships had not started with Steve McQueen. It had started in childhood, in a household where a volatile father had taught her that love was something you earned through compliance, not something you received simply by existing. The recovery process was not quick and it was not comfortable. She has described it as the most difficult and most necessary work of her life. She began to trace the thread backward, from McQueen to Evans, to her earliest understanding of what it meant to be loved, and in doing so, she started to identify the places where she had chosen someone else's needs over her own sense of self. The awareness was painful, but it was also, eventually, liberating. In the 1990s, Ali relocated to Tesuque, a small village just north of Santa Fe, New Mexico. The move was not a retreat from life. It was a deliberate return to herself. Surrounded by the quiet landscape of the high desert, she began rebuilding her days around things that were genuinely hers: painting, gardening, animal welfare, and a spiritual practice rooted in presence rather than performance. The community she found there was real and grounding in a way that Hollywood, for all its glamour, had never quite managed to be. Today, Ali MacGraw is in her mid-80s, and by her own account, she is more herself than she has ever been. The journey from the glittering heights of love story to the quiet clarity of her life in New Mexico has been long, nonlinear, and at times almost unbearably costly. But she has arrived somewhere real, somewhere that belongs entirely to her, built without anyone else's approval as the blueprint. She speaks about Steve McQueen now with a kind of measured honesty that neither romanticizes the relationship nor erases the love that was genuinely there. He was, she acknowledges, a deeply damaged man whose pain made him both irresistible and ultimately impossible to build a life with. The affair that ended her marriage to Robert Evans was not a simple scandal. It was the first movement in a far more complicated story about identity, self-sacrifice, and the devastating cost of loving someone more than you love yourself. What fans find stunning when they hear Ali speak about all of this now is not the affair itself. It is the clarity with which she describes the invisible mechanisms of her own erasure, the small surrenders that accumulated over years into a total loss of self. And it is the quiet, hard-won courage with which she chose, eventually, to come back. The Ali MacGraw who exists today is not the one who stood on red carpets in the early 1970s. She is something rarer and more enduring, a woman who lost herself completely, found her way back, and lived to tell the truth about every step of the journey.